Montana Territory, 1885. Jess McCrae owned the meanest horse in 3 counties, and he was fixing to lose the last of his patience with him. The stallion's name was Samson. 17 hands of solid black muscle, a temper like a lit fuse, and a habit of throwing every rider fool enough to climb on his back inside of 8 seconds flat. Jess had bought him cheap off a drover passing through, cheap on account of nobody else would touch him. 6 months later, Jesse understood exactly why. "That's $12 I paid for that animal," he told his hired hand Silas, picking himself up out of the corral dust for the 3rd time that week. $12 to get thrown on my backside every other morning." "Sell him," Silas said. "Man in Bozeman'll take him off your hands. Man in Bozeman'll shoot him inside a month." Jess didn't say the rest of it out loud, but Silas knew him well enough to hear it anyway. Samson had come from the same drover who'd sold Jesse's late father his last horse, the one that carried him home the night of the accident that took him. There was no reasonable explanation for why that mattered. It just did. So Jesse kept the horse, and the horse kept throwing him, and the ranch's fences kept needing mending on account of Samson testing every one of them nightly, looking for a way out. It was a Tuesday in April when the trouble came to a head. Samson had busted clean through the north pasture fence, and it took Jesse and Silas the better part of a morning, tracking him down along the river bottom. And by the time they got him back in the corral, Jesse had a torn sleeve, a bruised shoulder, and a temper of his own starting to match the horse's. "I mean it this time," he said, wiping blood off a scraped knuckle. "Something's got to give." He had no notion, standing there in that trampled corral, that the something was about to arrive on a chestnut mare not 20 minutes later, wearing men's trousers, and a look that said she'd heard every excuse a stubborn rancher ever gave for a horse he couldn't handle. Jesse's ranch sat 8 miles outside Bozeman, 400 acres his father had carved out of raw prairie 20 years back, and it had been a hard 400 acres to hold on to since the accident. He'd inherited the land, the debt against it, and a stubborn streak that Silas liked to say ran deeper than the mortgage. 29 years old, unmarried, and increasingly resigned to the notion that a man who couldn't manage his own horse had no business thinking he could manage anything else, least of all a wife. He'd tried everything he knew on Samson. Firm hands, patient hands, a trainer out of Billings who charged $8 and left with a limp of his own. Nothing had worked, and by that April morning, Jesse had about convinced himself nothing ever would. Her name was Josephine Calloway, though nobody in 3 counties called her anything but Josie, and she'd built a modest but growing reputation, gentling horses other men had given up on. She rode up to the McCrae ranch that same Tuesday afternoon, having heard through the Bozeman feed store that a rancher out this way had a stallion causing him grief, and grief, in her line of work, meant money. "Heard you got a horse nobody can ride," she said, swinging down off her mare before Jesse had even finished walking over. "Heard right, and heard wrong if you're fixing to offer." "I'm not offering. I'm asking to look at him first, then I'll tell you if I'm fixing to offer." Jesse looked her over. A woman maybe 24, sturdy in the saddle, hands already rough with the kind of work that didn't come from parlors, and found himself more curious than annoyed, which surprised him some. "He'll throw you," Jesse said. Not unkind, just fact the way he saw it. "Thrown better men than you off him all spring." "I didn't ask if he'd throw me, I asked to look at him." He walked her to the corral fence. Samson stood at the far end, ears pinned, watching them both the way he watched everything, like a threat he hadn't decided how to handle yet. Josie studied him a long, quiet moment, didn't approach the fence, didn't say a word for near a full minute, which Jesse found stranger than anything else about her so far. "He's not mean," she said finally. "Tell that to my shoulder. He's scared. Different thing entirely. Man who bred him probably beat that fear into him before you ever bought him, and every rider since has just proved him right that people hurt you when you trust them." Jesse didn't have an answer for that. Nobody had ever suggested Samson was afraid of anything, least of all him. "You're welcome to try your theory," Jesse said. "I'll fetch a splint for whatever bone you break proving it." Josie almost smiled at that. First crack in the composure. "I'll take that as a challenge, Mr. McCrae. Wasn't meant as one. Everything a stubborn man says is a challenge, whether he means it or not." She walked the fence line a moment longer, studying the corral's condition, the busted rail from that morning's chase, the trampled ground, the way Samson's eyes tracked every motion like a threat needing sorting. She noted all of it out loud, plain and businesslike, the way a doctor might list symptoms before naming a cure. Ground's too torn up. He's testing every boundary because nobody's shown him one that holds. And that rail's been mended 3 times by the look of it, which tells me you've been fixing the fence instead of fixing the horse. Fence was easier. Fence is always easier. Rarely the actual problem, though. That was the whole first meeting. No fanfare. Just a woman studying a horse he'd nearly given up on, and a rancher standing there wondering why he suddenly wanted her to stay past supper. She didn't stay past supper that first day. But she came back the next morning, and the morning after that, and by the end of the first week, Jesse had stopped pretending he didn't watch for her mare coming up the road. The kindnesses started small, same as most things worth having do. Her first real gesture wasn't toward Jesse at all. It was toward Samson. She spent 3 full days doing nothing but standing at the corral fence, morning and evening, saying nothing, asking nothing, just being present in the horse's sight, until he stopped flattening his ears the moment she appeared. "That's it?" Jesse asked on the 3rd evening. "Just standing there?" Trust doesn't come from doing something to a creature. It comes from doing nothing to it, long enough that it learns nothing bad's coming, words to live by, words to break horses by. Living's a separate lesson. He laughed at that, a real laugh, first one in longer than he'd have cared to count. Her second gesture came at his expense, and he never once asked for it. Jesse's knuckles had swelled up something fierce from the scrape he'd taken chasing Samson down along the river, and he'd been favoring his right hand all week, trying to hide it, the way stubborn men do. Josie caught him wincing, pulling a saddle cinch tight. "Let me see that. It's fine. It's swollen up like a poisoned toad, is what it is. Let me see it." He let her see it, mostly because arguing with her took more energy than he had left in him that particular evening. She wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn clean from her own kerchief, tight and practiced, the way a person wraps a hand who's tended plenty of scrapes before, on horses and men both. "You've done this before," he said. "Grew up with 4 brothers and a father who broke horses for a living before me. Somebody in that house was always bleeding from something. Sounds like a loud house. Sounds like a house that's mostly quiet now," she said, and something in her voice closed the subject before he could ask further, so he didn't. The 3rd gesture he gave to her, though he'd have called it nothing at all if she'd asked him to name it. Josie had been riding out from a rented room above the Bozeman Mercantile every morning, 6 miles each way, to work with Samson. And Jesse noticed she was arriving later and later each week, her mare looking more tired for it. So one morning he simply said, "There's a room in the bunkhouse loft. Empty since my last hired hand quit. You're welcome to it. Save your mare the trip if it suits you. What's it cost? Nothing. You're doing more work on this ranch than I'm paying you for as it stands. I don't take charity, Mr. McCrae. Wasn't offering charity. Offering a bunk in exchange for you not killing my horse's only chance at a decent life with 6 miles of hard riding every morning." She studied him a beat, the same careful studying she gave Samson those first 3 days, and finally nodded. $2 a week," she said. "For the room, I insist. $1, $1.50, deal," he said. And neither of them mentioned that $1.50 covered maybe a third of what the room was worth. And both of them let that math sit unspoken between them, the way most honest arrangements between 2 proud people tend to. The 4th gesture came from Samson himself, in a manner of speaking, though Jesse always credited Josie with it. 3 weeks into her work, she stood at the corral fence one morning and simply opened the gate and walked in, slow, hands loose at her sides. No rope, no halter, nothing in her hands at all. Jess's heart about stopped watching it. Samson watched her come, ears forward, not pinned. That was new. He'd never once let a soul walk that corral without pinning his ears flat and showing the whites of his eyes. She stopped 6 feet shy of him, waited, didn't reach for him, just stood there, same as she'd stood at that fence for 3 straight days back at the start. And then, slow as anything, Samson closed the last 6 feet himself and put his nose against her open palm. Jess didn't move. Didn't breathe, if he was honest about it. "There," Josie said, quiet to the horse and not to Jesse at all. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." Jesse found his voice about a full minute later. "I've owned that animal the better part of a year. Never once got that close. You never once stopped trying to fix him fast. Fixing scared things fast just teaches them to be scared of you too." He thought about that a long while after she'd gone up to the bunkhouse loft that evening. Thought about his father. and the horse that carried him home the night he died, and how he'd spent 6 months trying to make Samson pay for something that horse never did. The fifth gesture came near a month in, small as anything, but Jesse never forgot it. Josie had noticed his boots were near worn through at the sole. The kind of wear a man ignores because new boots cost $4 he didn't have spare that month. Not with the mortgage due and a hired trainer's fee still owed from the Billings man's failed attempt back in the winter. She said nothing about it directly. But the following week, a package arrived from the Bozeman cobbler, paid for and addressed to Jesse McCrae, containing a fresh set of resoled boots. His own boots, in fact, which she'd quietly taken into town without his noticing and had mended rather than replaced, at a fraction of the cost new ones would have run. "You didn't have to do that," he said, turning the boots over in his hands. "Didn't do much. Cobbler did the work. I just noticed you needed it before you'd have admitted it yourself. That's becoming a habit of yours. Noticing things? Or people not admitting what they need? Both, I suppose. Somebody's got to," she said, and went back to her work with Samson like the matter was settled, which, as far as she was concerned, it was. He took to noticing things about her in turn after that. That she favored her coffee black and bitter. That she went quiet certain evenings around the anniversary of something she never named outright. That she hummed old hymn tunes under her breath while working leather, half without knowing she did it. He never mentioned any of it aloud. Just filed each one away, same as she'd filed away his worn-through boots, and let the knowing sit between them unspoken, the way most things worth keeping tend to. Now, before we go on, let me say, I'm grateful for every one of you listening tonight. Whether you're in your kitchen in Ohio, or riding a night shift somewhere clear across the ocean. I've had folks write in from Australia, from Ireland, telling me these old stories keep them company. That means more to me than you know. Now back to Jesse and Josie. It was Silas, of all people, who said the plain thing neither Jesse nor Josie had managed to say themselves. He'd been watching the pair of them for the better part of a month. Watching Jesse linger over supper conversations that used to last 4 minutes, and now stretched past an hour. Watching Josie find reasons to walk the long way past the house instead of straight to the barn. One evening, mending tack in the barn alongside Jesse, Silas set his work down and said it plain. "You're gentler with her than you've ever been with anybody, including yourself. We're talking about a horse, Silas. We were talking about a horse 20 minutes ago. Last 10 minutes, you've been talking about her boots and her laugh, and how she takes her coffee. That ain't horse talk anymore." Jesse didn't answer that right away. Couldn't, if he was honest. "She's a hired hand," he said finally. Weak, and he knew it even as he said it. "She's the first thing that's made you stop chasing your daddy's ghost around that corral in a year. Call it whatever you like, Jesse. I know what I'm looking at." Jesse sat with that a long while after Silas turned in that night. Sat with it long enough that the barn lamp burned low, and he had to relight it just to see his own hands. The direct ask, when it finally came from Jesse, and it came without any of the polish he'd have liked it to have. It was 6 weeks into her work with Samson. 6 weeks of shared suppers and mended knuckles, and a horse that had gone from throwing every rider to letting Josie sit astride him bareback in the evening light. When Jesse found her at the corral fence one night, watching Samson graze easy in the moonlight. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I'd appreciate it if you let me get all the way through it before you answer, on account of I've been working up the nerve for the better part of a week." "That bad?" "Worse. I've never been good with words, Josie. Ask Silas S. Ask anybody. You came out here to fix a horse, and you did that better than I had any right to expect. But somewhere in the middle of it, I stopped caring near as much about the horse, and started caring a whole lot more about whether you were staying past sundown, or whether you'd finish the job and ride on to the next ranch that needed fixing. And I don't want you to ride on. That's the whole of it. I don't have a fancy way to say it beyond that." She was quiet a moment, and the quiet stretched long enough that Jesse's stomach had time to sink clean through his boots. "You know what I told that horse first week I met him?" she said finally. "I told him trust doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from somebody showing up quiet day after day until you believe they're not going anywhere. You did that, Jesse McCrae. Every single day for 6 weeks you did that, without once asking me for anything in return. That an answer?" "That's an answer. Yes, I'm asking the same of you that you asked of me." Word of the whole arrangement reached Josie's father inside of a month, on account of her younger brother passing through Bozeman and putting two and two together at the mercantile. Ezra Calloway arrived at the McCrae Ranch on a Sunday, driving a fine buggy, and made his position known before he'd even climbed down from the seat. "There's a man in Helena," Ezra said. Once introductions had been made and coffee poured, none of which softened the directness of what followed. "Runs a proper horse-breeding operation, 300 head strong. Owns his own land outright. No debts against it. Asked after Josie twice this past year. Never met the man," Josie said. "You met him at your cousin's christening. Fine manners. Steady income. A house with a real parlor, Josie. Not a bunkhouse loft you're paying $1.50 a week to sleep in. I like the loft. You like the loft because you've convinced yourself hard work is the same thing as a good life. It isn't, Josie. I raised you to break horses because your mother's people always had a gift for it. Not so you'd spend your whole life sleeping in another man's bunkhouse, fixing his problems for $1.50 a week." Jess, standing off to the side, felt the weight of every one of those words, on account of they weren't wrong, not exactly. He had little to offer beyond a ranch, still climbing out of debt, and a horse that had taken a year, and a stranger's patience to gentle. "Mr. Calloway," Jessie said finally, "you're not wrong that I've got less to offer than a man with 300 head and land free of debt. I won't pretend otherwise." "Then you understand my position." "I understand it. But I'd ask you consider one thing before you ride back to Helena and put in a good word for that other fellow. Your daughter walked into a corral with a horse that had thrown every soul brave or fool enough to try him, and she didn't tame him with money or land or fine manners. She tamed him standing still day after day, letting him learn slow that she wasn't going anywhere. That's the same thing she's asking of any man fixing to court her, I'd wager, though she's too proud to say it plain. I can't offer 300 head of horses, Mr. Calloway, but I can offer that. I'm not going anywhere." Ezra Calloway sat with that a long moment, coffee cooling, gaze moving from Jessie to his daughter and back again. "That's a fine speech," he said finally. "Doesn't pay debts." "No, sir, it doesn't. But it might be the truest thing anybody's said to me about my daughter since her mother passed." He left that afternoon without another word about the man in Helena. 6 weeks later, he sent out 2 mares as a wedding gift, sired from his own stock, which Josie understood, without either of them saying so, to be the closest thing to a blessing her father had left in him to give. But Ezra hadn't left before saying one more thing to his daughter, alone, while Jessie was seeing to the buggy horses. "You know I only ever wanted you settled comfortable," he said. "Your mother always said I worried too plain about it." "I know, Papa. That rancher's got less than half what Harding could offer you. He's got more than Harding ever could, though you won't hear it in dollars. Harding's never once stood at a fence for 3 days doing nothing, but proving to something scared that he wasn't a danger. Jessie has. I watched him learn it same as I taught it, and I've never seen a man learn a hard lesson that patient in my whole life." Ezra was quiet a moment, watching Jessie lead the buggy team out from the barn. Patient and unhurried, even with a stranger's judgment sitting heavy in the yard. "Your mother would have liked him," he said finally, gruff, and said nothing further on the matter, which from Ezra Calloway was as close to a blessing spoken aloud as anybody was like to get. "I chose this," Josie told Jessie that evening, once her father's buggy had rolled out of sight down the long dirt road. "I want you to understand it was a choice, and not the only one on offer. My father laid the easier road out plain as anything, and I looked hard at it, and I chose the harder one anyway, same as I'd choose it every time you asked." "Why?" Jessie asked, though some part of him already knew. "Because of 3 days standing at a fence, saying nothing, until a scared animal learned nobody in that corral wanted to hurt him. Because you gave up your bunkhouse loft, rather than let me ride 6 miles exhausted every morning. Because when your knuckles were swollen fit to burst, you still reached for that cinch strap without one word of complaint, same as you've reached for every hard thing in your life without complaint. A man like that doesn't need 300 head of horses to be worth choosing, Jessie. He just needs to keep showing up. And you have. Every day." He didn't have a fine speech left to match hers. He'd spent the only one he had on her father. $12, he said instead. "That's what I paid for that stallion. Best $12 I ever spent, on account of what it brought riding up the road behind him. That's a low bar to clear, comparing me to a horse, highest bar there is, where I'm standing. That horse taught me more about patience in 6 weeks than I'd learned in 30 years living. Then we're settled, she said. Same as that horse settled. Slow and true and worth every bit of the waiting. They married that October, at the ranch itself, under the same cottonwood tree, where Josie had first tied her chestnut mare, the day she rode up asking about a stallion nobody could handle. Silas stood as witness, having earned the right plainly, and made no secret of reminding anybody within earshot that he'd said as much a full 2 months before either of the two fools, standing at the altar, had figured it out themselves. Ezra Calloway walked his daughter the short distance from the house to the cottonwood, and though he said little, he shook Jesse's hand firm at the end of the ceremony, which both men understood to be worth more than any fine speech either was capable of giving. Josie wore a practical green wool dress, better suited to ranch living than any fine silk, and Jesse wore his father's old church coat, mended at the cuff by Josie's own hand 2 weeks prior, a small detail neither mentioned outright, though both noticed it every time his sleeve caught the light. Samson stood saddled and calm at the edge of the gathering the whole ceremony through, the first time in his life he'd stood saddled among a crowd, without so much as flattening an ear, which Silas called the finest proof of the whole matter that anybody needed. The wedding supper was simple: beans, cornbread, and a cake Josie's youngest brother had ridden 2 days to deliver, packed in straw to keep it from crumbling on the trail, a gesture that made Josie cry harder than any part of the ceremony itself had managed. Jesse kept the torn kerchief Josie had first wrapped his knuckles with, washed and folded away in a drawer, never mentioning to her that he'd kept it. She found it there years later and never told him she'd found it either, and that small scrap of cloth became its own quiet monument to the 6 weeks that had turned a stranger into a wife. 4 years later, the McCrae Ranch had grown some by then. 60 head of cattle, a proper horse breeding operation running alongside it, that had become near as well known through the territory as Josie's gentling reputation ever was on its own. And 2 children, a girl of 2 and a boy just shy of his first birthday. Samson, gray now at the muzzle, but still the finest stud on the place, had sired 11 foals since that first wedding day, every one of them gentled the same patient way his mother, as Josie liked to call herself, half joking, had gentled him. Silas still worked the ranch, though he'd taken to grumbling good-naturedly that he ought to be paid double for having predicted the whole romance before either party involved had the sense to see it. One evening that autumn, Jesse found Josie at the corral fence, same fence where he'd first watched her walk unarmed toward a horse that had thrown every man fool enough to try him, watching their daughter toddle unsteady toward the same fence rail, reaching a small hand up toward Samson's graying nose. She's not afraid of him at all, Jesse said. Why would she be? She's never known him any way but gentle. Took me the better part of a year to learn that same lesson. Took you exactly as long as it needed to. No shorter, no longer. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, the same shoulders that had carried a stranger's confidence into a corral full of danger 4 years back. And they stood there together a long while, watching their daughter's small hand rest easy against the graying nose of a horse that had once thrown every soul who came near him, now standing steady and unafraid for a child who'd never known him any other way. Silas still tells anybody who'll listen he saw this coming before we did, Jesse said. Silas isn't wrong, much as I hate admitting it. Man's insufferable about it. Man's earned the right to be, seeing as he was. Their son fussed from the porch just then, and Josie went to fetch him, and Jesse stayed a moment longer at the fence, watching Samson lower his graying head toward his daughter's small reaching hand. Patient as anything, the same way Josie had once stood patient at that same fence for 3 straight days, until a scared animal learned nobody in that corral meant him harm. It occurred to Jesse, standing there, that he'd learned the very same lesson himself, in the very same corral, and it had taken him a good deal longer than 3 days to learn it. But he'd learned it all the same, and that, he figured, was the whole of what mattered. Now, friends, if you've ridden this whole story out with me tonight, I thank you for it. Here's what I've come to believe, thinking on Jesse and Josie and that stubborn old stallion. The things worth having in this life rarely come to us fast, and they rarely come to us because we forced them. They come because somebody was patient enough to keep showing up, quiet and steady, long after it would have been easier to walk away. A scared horse doesn't learn to trust because you break him. He learns because you stand still long enough to prove you're not the danger he thinks you are. Turns out people aren't so different. If there's someone in your life who's still learning to trust you, or someone you're still learning to trust yourself, I hope you find the patience to stand still a while longer. It's worth it, every time. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. Until next time, keep listening.